Chapter 12 of Observations of an Orderly. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marianne Spiegel. Observations of an Orderly by Ward Muir. Chapter 12. The Cockney. Before I enlisted, I was lodging in a house which it was occasionally convenient to approach by a short cut through an area of slumland. One night, when traversing this slum, the hour was 1:30 a.m., I was stopped by a couple of women who told me that there was a man lying on the ground in an adjacent alley. They thought he must be ill. Would I come and look at him? They led me down a turning which opened into a narrow court. This court was reached by an arched tunnel through tenement houses. The tunnel was pitchy black, but I struck matches as I proceeded, and presently we came upon the object of my companion's solicitude, a young soldier, propped against the wall, with his legs projecting across the flagstones. The women had, in fact, discovered him by tripping over those legs in the darkness. They were slatternly women, but warm-hearted, and when I had managed to arouse the gentleman in khaki and hoist him to his feet, for the cause of his indisposition was plain, and he had slept it off, they called down blessings on my head and overwhelmed our friend with sympathy, which he did not wholly deserve, and to which he made no rejoinder. Nor did he vouchsafe any very lucid answer when I asked him whither he was bound. I was prepared to pilot him, but I could hardly do so without knowing towards which point of the compass he proposed to steer, or rather to be steered. "I know where I want to go," was all I could get out of him. Very well. If he knew his address, it was no concern of mine. He could lead on. I would act as a mere supporter. In this capacity, with my arm linked firmly in his, I brought him forth from the tunnel to the street. He had no wish, it seemed, to go through the tunnel into the court. And here we bade farewell to the ladies. "Which way now?" I inquired. My charge responded not, but crossed to a corner and meandered up one of those interminable thoroughfares which lead out of London into the suburbs. Trudging with him and helping him to sustain his balance, which was not as stable as could be wished, I plied him with mildly genial conversation, and at last elicited a few vague answers. These were couched in the Cockney idiom, but I caught a faint nasal twang which led me to suspect that the speaker had come from the other side of the Atlantic. Yes, he told me, he had just arrived from Canada. We had proceeded a short distance, when on the further side of the street I descried a golden halo, which outlined the silhouette of a coffee stall. It occurred to me that a cup of hot coffee would be a good tonic to disperse the last symptoms of my friend's indiscretion. So I deflected him across the road, and we brought up, together, alongside the coffee stall's counter. Lest the reader should be unacquainted with that unique creation, the coffee stall, I must explain that it is nocturnal in habit, emerging from its lair only between the hours of 11 p.m. and 7 a.m. It is an equipage of which the interior is inhabited by a fat, jolly man, at least according to my experience he is always fat and jolly, surrounded by steaming urns, plates of cake, buns of a citron yellow hue, pale pastries, ham sandwiches, and packets of cigarettes. The upper panels of one of its sides unfold to form a bar below and a penthouse roof above, the latter being generally extended into an awning. The awning is a protection for the customer, not against the sun, a luminary from whose assaults the London coffee stalls have little to fear, but against the rain. Thanks to these awnings, and the chattiness of the fat jolly man, and the warmth exhaled by the urns, and the circumstance that the public houses are shut, our coffee stalls are able to sell two brownish beverages, called respectively coffee and tea, which otherwise could hardly hope to achieve the honour of human consumption. Fate has guided me on many midnight pilgrimages through the town, and I have imbibed, sometimes with relish, the liquids alluded to. I have also partaken of the pallid pastry and the citron yellow buns. I am therefore in a position to write, for the benefit of persons less well informed, a treatise on coffee stalls. This I shall refrain from doing. The one point it is necessary for me to mention is that the fat jolly man, being deplorably distrustful, does not supply casual customers with teaspoons. You may have a cup of alleged tea, 1 penny, or a cup of alleged coffee, 1 penny. A dollop of sugar is dropped into the cup. The fat jolly man gives the mixture a stir round with a teaspoon. Then he places the cup before you on the bar, but the teaspoon is still in his grasp. I dare say he would lend you the teaspoon if you requested him to do so, but unless you have that audacity, he prefers to keep the teaspoon on his side of the bar, out of harm's way. This may seem strange when you perceive that the teaspoon is fashioned of a metal unknown to silversmiths, and might be priced at 3 pence, but even a 3 penny teaspoon is a souvenir which some collectors would not despise. Presumably, regular customers receive teaspoons, for teaspoons lie in a heap on the fat jolly man's side of the counter. This was the case at the coffee stall before which the young soldier and I ranged ourselves, and the heap of teaspoons seemed to exercise a curious fascination upon the soldier. He continued to stare at them for some minutes after I had set in front of him his cup of coffee. Then he stared at the fat jolly man who was cutting slabs from a loaf. He stared for a long time, making no reply to my remarks. Rain began to patter on the awning. It had rained earlier in the night, and I became aware of a figure lurking in the background on the pavement, beyond the awning's shelter, but within the radius of the haze of light projected therefrom. It was a wretched, slinking figure, that of an elderly man with bleared eyes and a red nose, one of those pariahs who haunt cab-stands and promote the cabs up the rank when the front vehicle is hailed. This special specimen of his breed appeared to be a satellite of the coffee-stall proprietor. Perhaps he helped to tow the stall to its berth. Whatever might be his function, he lingered on the outskirts of the ring of light, watching us. And the young soldier, in his slow scrutiny of the stall and its surroundings, caught sight of him, and stared stolidly, as he had stared at everything else. I was in the act of drinking my coffee when the soldier suddenly leant across the counter, picked up a spoon, turned, and threw it at the derelict whose face wavered on the edge of the lamplight circle. The victim of this extraordinary attack dodged the missile, then grovelled after it in the gutter. Meanwhile the fat man, instantaneously ceasing to be jolly, gave vent to an angry protest. "What you do that for? Chucking my spoons apart? Drunk, that's what you are." "Ain't drunk," said the soldier. "What you chuck my spoon at him for, then? He ain't done you no harm." "Yes, he has," was the soldier's surprising retort. "No, he ain't." "Yes, he has." "No, he ain't. He ain't done you no harm." To which the derelict chimed in. He had retrieved the spoon, and now advanced timidly with it under the awning. "I ain't done you no harm," a husky whimpering chorus to his fat patron. The soldier fixed the derelict with a fierce glare. "Yes, you have," he reiterated. I was wondering how the dispute might develop, but evidently my ear is unattuned to the nuances of these dialectics. The soldier's glare and the soldier's tone must have betrayed themselves to the two other men, as factitious. The derelict, anyhow, lost his nervousness, and, approaching nearer, scanned the soldier with dim, peering eyes, then broke into a joyous grin, and exclaimed, "Lummy, if it ain't old Bert!" And the fat man, leaning on the counter and likewise examining the soldier, cried, "Old Bert it is!" "Knew you in 2 ticks," grunted Bert. "Same old Harry," this was the derelict. "Same old Herb," this was the fat, and once again jolly, man. Explanations ensued. Bert, the young soldier, was a native of these parts. He had emigrated to Canada 5 years previously. Tonight, en route for the front, he had returned. Earlier in the evening there had been ill-advised libations. He had started for his home, felt sleepy, sheltered from the wet in a tunnel quite familiar to him, and there been discovered by the ladies and roused by myself. Arrived at the coffee stall, he had recognized in its proprietor a former pal, and another former pal in Airy the derelict. To throw the spoon at Airy was merely his playful mode of announcing his identity. I left the trio, reviewing the past and exchanging news of the present. My services, it was clear, would no longer be required by the prodigal. He and his mates gave me a hearty good night. I did not guess how intimate was soon to be my association with the Berts, Aries, and Herbs of the world. I was to be their servant, to wait upon them, to perform menial tasks for them, to wash them and dress them and undress them, to carry them in my arms. I was to see them suffer, and to learn to respect their gameness and the wry, grousing humor which is their almost universal trait. In my own wards and elsewhere in the hospital I came in close contact with many Cockneys of the slums. Even when one had not precisely placed a patient of this description, the relatives who came to him on visiting days gave the clue to the stock from which he sprang. The mother was sometimes a flower girl, the sweetheart with a very feathered hat, and hair which evidently lived in curling pins except on great occasions, probably worked in a factory. These people, if the patient were confined to bed, sat beside him and talked in a subdued, throaty whisper. But I have seen the same sort of patient, well enough to walk about, meet his folks on visiting afternoons at the hospital gate. There is a crowd at the hospital gate, passing in and going out. Hosts of patients are waiting, some in wheeled chairs, and some seated on the iron fence which fringes the drive. The reunions which occur at that gate are exceedingly public. Our East Ender is perhaps accustomed to publicity. His slum does not conceal his feelings. It quarrels and makes love, without drawn blinds, and privacy is not an essential of its ardors. Be that as it may, these meetings at the hospital gate, which are not lacking in pathos, have sometimes manifested a tear-compelling comicality when the actors in the drama belonged to the class which produced Bert. In a higher class there is restraint and a rather stupid bashfulness. I have seen a wounded youngster flush apprehensively and only peck his mother in return for her sobbing embrace. That is not Bert's way. He knows, he is not a fool, that his mother looks a trifle absurd as, with bonnet awry, she surges perspiringly past the sentries, the tails of her skirt dragging in the dust, and her feet flattened with the weight of overclad, unwholesome obesity they have to bear. But he hobbles spryly to meet her, and his salute is no mere peck, but a smacking kiss, so noisy that it makes everyone laugh. He laughs too. Perhaps he did it on purpose to raise a laugh. That is his quaint method. But the fact remains that, whatever his motive, he has managed to please his mother. She is sniffing loudly, yet laughing also, and one could want no better picture of human affection than of this Bermondsey Bert and his shapeless, work-distorted, maybe bibulous-looking mother, exchanging that resounding and ungraceful kiss at the hospital gate. I have heard Bert shout "Mother" from 100 yards off when he spied her coming through the gate. No false shame there, no smug good form in that, nor in the time-honored jest which follows, "And have you remembered to bring me a bottle of beer, mother?" Of course visitors are not allowed to introduce alcohol into the hospital, otherwise I am afraid there is no doubt that mother would have obliged. In one of our wards we harbored, for a while, a costermonger. This coster, an entertaining and plucky creature, who had to have a leg amputated, received no callers on visiting day. His own relatives were dead, and he and his wife had separated. "Couldn't it at arf," he exclaimed, and with laudable impartiality added, "Married beneath her, she did, when she married me." As the lady herself was a coster, it was plain that, here, as in other grades of society, there are degrees, conventions, and barriers, which may not be lightly overstepped. Sister, however, thought that the patient should inform his wife that he had lost his leg, and prevailed on him to send her a letter to that effect. A few days later he was asked, "Well, did you write and tell your wife you had lost a leg?" "Yes." "I suppose she's answered. What has she said?" "Said I'm a liar." Her retort had neither disconcerted nor offended him. He was a philosopher, and, like so many of his kind, a laughing philosopher. When he was sufficiently recovered from his operation to get about on crutches, he was the wag of the ward. He took special delight in those practical jokes which are invented by patients to tease the nurses, and devoted the most painstaking ingenuity to their preparation. It was he who found a small hole in the lath and plaster wall which separates the ward from the ward's kitchen. Through this hole a length of cotton was passed and tied to the handle of a mug on the kitchen shelf. At this period, owing to Zeppelin raids, only the barest minimum of light was allowed, and the night nurse, when she entered the kitchen, went into almost complete darkness. No sooner was she in the kitchen and fumbling for what she required than a faint noise, that of the cup being twitched by the cotton leading to the mischievous coster's bed, arose on the shelf and convinced her that she was in the presence of a mouse. She retreated, and perhaps if any convalescent patient had been awake, she would have enlisted his aid to expel the mouse. But in the ward the patients were, as one man, snoring vociferously. It was this slightly overdone snoring at the finish which gave birth to suspicions and caused the trick to be detected. The night nurses do not have a placid time of it if their patients are at the stage of recovery when spirits begin to rise, and the early slumber hour which the hospital rules prescribe is not welcome. String-actuated knaveries, more or less similar to the mouse in the kitchen one, are always devised for the plaguing of a new night nurse. Sometimes in the dead of night, when utter silence broods over the ward, the gramophone will abruptly burst into raucous music. Its mechanism has been released by a contrivance which gives no clue to the crime's perpetrator. The flustered nurse gropes her way down the ward and stops the gramophone. Every patient, meanwhile, sitting up in bed and protesting against her cruelty in having awakened them by starting it. Half an hour after the ward has quietened, the other gramophone, some wards have two, whirs off into impudent song. It also has been primed. Nurse is wiser on future occasions. She stows the gramophones when she comes on duty, where no one can tamper with them. Even so, she may have her nerves preyed upon by eerie tinklings, impossible to locate in the darkness. These are caused by two knives, hung from a nail fixed high up in the rafters. By jiggling a string, which is conducted over another rafter and down the wall to his pillow, the patient makes the knife blades clash. Sometimes two strings, leading to different beds, complete this instrument of torture. After a determined search, nurse finds one string, and, having cut it, flatters herself that she has got the better of her enemies. Not a bit of it. She has scarcely settled into her chair again before the tinklings recommence. The second string is in action, and as she hunts about the ward for the source of the melody in the ceiling, muffled convulsions of mirth from the dim row of beds furnish evidence that her naughty charges are not getting the repose which they require, and to ensure which is part of the purpose of her presence. A nurse who happens to be unpopular never has these pranks played upon her. They are in the nature of a compliment, nor do they occur in a ward where there is a patient seriously ill. It is impossible to imagine war hospital patients acting inconsiderately toward a distressed comrade. This observation renders all the more amusing the scandalized concern which I once beheld on the demure physiognomy of a visiting clergyman when he gathered the drift of certain allusions to a case on the danger list. The name of the danger list explains itself. When a patient is put on the danger list, his relatives are sent for, and may be with him, whether it is the visiting afternoon or not. If they come from the provinces, they are presented with a railway pass, and, if poor, are allotted lodgings near the hospital, a grant being made to them from our benevolent fund. For the information of the V.A.D.s who answer visitors' questions in the inquiry bureau at the main entrance to the hospital, a copy of the danger list hangs there, and it is on record that an awestruck child, seeing this column of patients' names and reading the heading, asked, "What does danger list mean? Does it mean it's dangerous to go near them?" Now in Ward C-22, a patient, a Cockney, was on the danger list, which circumstance availed nothing to depress his spirits. In spite of considerable pain, he poked fun at the prospect of his own imminent demise, and was himself the chief offender against the edict of quietness which Sister had issued for her ward. He would talk, and he would talk about undertakers, post-mortems, epitaphs, and the details of a military funeral. That there top note of the last post on the bugle Doesn't arf sound proper?" he said, a verdict which any one who has heard this beautiful and inspired fanfare, which is the farewell above a soldier's grave, and which ends on a soaring treble, will endorse. "But," he went on, "if the buglers add a drop of something warm on the way to the cemetery, that there top note always reminds me of an 'iccup. And if he hiccups over me, I shall want to spit in his eye, blimey if I won't." This persiflage had been going on for a couple of days, and getting to be more and more elaborate and elusive, infecting the entire ward, so that the fact that the man was on the danger list had become a kind of catchword amongst his fellows. Entered, in all innocence, the clergyman. "The very bloke to put me up to all the tricks," from the irreverent one. At the same moment a walking patient, also a Cockney, who had been reading a newspaper, gave vent to a cry of feigned horror. "Boys," he announced, "it says 'ere there's a shortage of timber." Guffaws greeted this sally. Every one saw the innuendo at once, every one except the clergyman, and when he grasped the point that old chum so-and-so was on the danger list and a shortage of timber was supposed to imply that he might be done out of a coffin, he was visibly shocked. Perhaps he did not understand Cockney humour. However, one may add that our irrepressible friend, at the moment of writing, is off the danger list, albeit only after a protracted struggle with the enemy at whom he jeered, and is now contriving to be as funny about life as he was funny and fearless about death. I caught sight to-day of another Cockney acquaintance of mine, whose Christian name is Bill, trundling himself down the hospital drive in a wheeled chair. Perched on the knee of his one leg, with its feet planted on the stump which is all that is left of the other, was his child, aged 4. Beside him walked his wife, resplendent in a magenta blouse and a hat with green and pink plumes. The trio looked happy, and Mrs. Bill's gala attire was symbolical. When Bill was in my ward, he too was on the danger list. I remember that when he first came to us, before his operation, and before he took a turn for the worse, his wife visited him in that same magenta blouse, or another equally startling, and that for some reason she and sister did not quite hit it off, had words, and subsequently for a period were not on speaking terms. Later, when Bill underwent his operation and began to sink, his bed was moved out on to the ward's veranda. Here his wife, now wearing a subdued blouse, sat beside him hour after hour, while little Bill, the child, towed a cheap wooden engine up and down the grass patch, oblivious to the ordeal through which his parents were passing. It was my business, as orderly, to intrude at intervals upon the scene on the veranda, to bring Bill such food as he was able to tolerate. On the first occasion, after Bill's collapse, that I prepared to take him a cup of tea, sister stopped me. "Don't forget to take tea and some bread and butter to that poor woman. She looks tired. And some milk for the child." "Very good, sister." I cut bread and butter, and filled an extra mug of tea. "Orderly, what are you doing?" Sister had reappeared, and I was rebuked because I was going to offer Mrs. Bill her tea in a tin mug (all the patients have tin mugs), and had cut her bread and butter too thick. I must cut dainty slices of thin bread and butter, use sister's own chinaware, and serve the whole spread on a tray with a cloth. All of which was typical of sister, who from that day treated Bill's wife with true tenderness, and Bill's wife became one of sister's most enthusiastic adorers. It came to pass, after a week of pitiful anxiety, that the medical officer pronounced Bill safe once more. "Bloke says I'm not going to pick art," he told me. I congratulated him, and remarked that his wife would be thankful when he met her, on her arrival, with such splendid news. "I'll have the laugh of my missus," said Bill. "When she comes, I shall tell her I've some serious news for her, and she's ter send the kid darn to the grass to play. Then I'll pull a long fice, and ask her to bear up, and say I'm sorry for her, and she mustn't take it too rough, and all that. And she has my sympathy in her disappointment. She ain't ter get her widow's pension after all." I believe this programme was carried through, more or less, to the letter. Certain it is that I myself overheard another of Bill's grim pleasantries. He was explaining to Madame that they must apprentice their offspring to the engineering trade. "I want to make little Bill a motor chap, so's he can oil the ball bearings of me fancy leg what I'm ter get at Roehampton." The "fancy leg" ended by being the favorite theme of Bill's disgraceful extravaganzas. He would announce to sister, when she was dressing his stump, that he had been studying means of earning his living in the future, and had decided to become a professor of roller skating. He would loudly tell his wife that she would never again be able to summons him for assault by kicking. The fancy leg would not give the real one sufficient purchase for an effective kick, and she was not to complain in future about his cold feet against her back in bed. There would only be one cold foot, the other would be unhitched and on the floor. And of course there were endless jokes about what had been done with the amputated leg, whether it had got a tombstone, and so forth, some of the suggestions going a trifle beyond what good taste, in more fastidious coteries, would have thought permissible. But Bill had his own ideas of the humorous, and maybe his own no less definite ideas of dignity. In this latter virtue I counted the fact that although once or twice, when he was very low, he gave way to a little fretting to me, he never, I am convinced, let fall one querulous word in the presence of his wife. She sat by her husband's side, and when things were at their worst the two said naught. The wife numbly watched Bill's face, turning now and then to glance at the activities of little Bill with his engine, or to smile her thanks to the patients who sometimes came and gave the child pickaback rides. When I intruded, I knew I was interrupting the communings of a loving and happily married pair, and the slangings of each other, which signalized Bill's recovery and his wife's relief, did nothing to shake my certitude that, like many slum dwellers, they owned a mutual esteem which other couples of superior station might envy. Personally, I have never known a Cockney patient who did not evoke affection, and as a matter of curiosity, I have been asking a number of sisters whether they liked to have Cockneys in their wards. Without a single exception, and let me say that sisters are both observant and critical, the answers have been enthusiastically in the affirmative. End of chapter 12.